When we're learning a new skill, it's equally, if not more important, to understand how to think than what to think. We need to have a knowledge base, i.e., learning what to think, to at least a degree to where we can take one concept and mirror it with another or build upon it, right? Because we can't build upon nothing. Or if we're talking about learning through symmetry, we can't look at the symmetrical opposite of something that doesn't exist, right? You can't divide by zero. So we have to establish a knowledge base first and foremost. In say something like weightlifting, where this might apply, learning through symmetry. This would be, let's say, we're taught a demonstration of how to do a one-arm row with a dumbbell, right? They teach us that we want to engage our lats, we want to row to the hip, we want to have some weight on the front foot, we want to keep a neutral spine, right? Someone's going to comment on my form, just understand it's a basic demonstration, right? Now we can see only the right side, and if we've missed the left side or they neglected to show it, we still have a fundamental knowledge base to now turn this around symmetrically and learn how to do the row from the left, right? We might have to consult our balance a few times and think, like go through a checklist of what we learned from one side and say, make sure we're doing it on the other. But we can teach ourselves. We don't need that coach anymore because it's simple. It's a static environment. Static because the weightlifting implement doesn't have any thoughts of its own to bring in chaos or to bring in variables that we're not privy to, because it doesn't have a mind of its own, right? It's always going to be the same. Obviously, we can load it differently and use different implements and so on, but we control all that. We know what we're doing. In something like boxing, an equivalent might be, let's say we are an orthodox fighter, and we've learned a knowledge base in throwing the jab. We're confident in our jab, right? We feel good. We feel like we know what we're doing. We know how much weight should be on our front foot. We know how to turn it over. We know how much to internally rotate our shoulders, right? We know how to pull back and not let our hands drop. All these things that are pretty fundamental, right? We've established that. Well, now we want to learn it in southpaw. We're still dealing with a situation that is static because we don't have an opponent. We're only consulting our own body. Our body is now the equivalent to that implement, right? Because it's just the other side of our body. We are the only autonomous player in this game. So we go from orthodox, we turn it southpaw, and now we can reasonably teach ourselves the form by just reversing it in a mirror image or being symmetrical. And then we can perform a checklist, right? From, say, the ground up. That's how I would do it. Saying like, okay, weight distribution. How much weight did I have on the front foot and the back foot? This feels natural. Okay, got it, right? And we build it up and so on. And this is actually a really apt example for myself because when I was learning how to jab in southpaw, I had a problem with externally rotating my shoulder too much. External rotation would be like going like this, right? Whereas internal rotation is like this, external, internal, right? Now, with my orthodox, I was turning over my punch well, so it was going down the center line. But when I came to southpaw, I was having problems where I was externally rotating, so it was off angle, right? It was too much to the outside of my body. That's another way you can remember the internal versus external rotation as it applies to boxing. Internal, closer to my body. External, further away, right? So as I did this checklist, I came to the top and I realized, oh, I'm going too far out. And then I realized, okay, this is how I want to jab. And then I learned through symmetry, right? But again, we're dealing with a static environment. There's nothing else. So this is just form and technique. When we're dealing with something like chess or soccer, or in this case boxing, that deals with other opponents, other players, other minds that we're not privy to that can introduce chaos and other variables. Now, we can still learn through symmetry, but instead of thinking about our form and technique, we're thinking about exploitation and strategy. And the way that we're doing that is we're thinking about our understanding mirrored with their understanding based upon the fundamental principles of their sport, in this case boxing, that we know are consistent or universal. What I mean by this is, say, I know that when I throw the jab, or I have a jab thrown at me, I want to slip to the outside, maybe more often than to the inside, because it gets me further away from his right hand, leaves me defensively responsible. Where slipping to the inside is a little bit more dangerous, right? Doesn't mean we never do it, but it means it's a little bit more dangerous. If I know this while I'm throwing the jab, I also know that my opponent knows this while he's receiving the jab, right? When he has the jab come at him, he's going to be going to the outside more often than the inside. Obviously, styles are going to dictate some minor alterations, but that's a pretty basic and fundamental thing. So from there, I can build a strategy off that, knowing, okay, when I jab, he's more likely to slip that way. So maybe when I jab, I want to step here and then throw a right hand, rather than if he was going to slip to the inside, where I could just follow up here, right? So without having already thrown this jab, I know he's likely to go that way more than this way. And so I adapt to that, and I throw the jab, and then I step laterally this way, and then I follow up with the right hand, and I can get him, right? I've come up with this strategy where I've gotten in his head by using my understanding of symmetry. In exchange, if, say, I am now my opponent in this same scenario, and this has happened a few times where I've gotten caught, I now know what my expectation is of my opponent and what types of punches he would throw if I'm going to slip the jab to the outside. So now I'm going to start slipping to the inside instead as a response. I know this. I'm still my opponent, right? Or I'm still me, right? But if I'm my opponent and now I'm slipping to the inside, I can now go back into my own brain and say, okay, once he starts adapting to this, instead of going here and then here, I'm going to go here and then here, right? So I have this whole evolution in my head of adapting to his adaptations, where I've gotten in his brain by just using fundamental tendencies, a knowledge base of boxing strategy against him, right? So that's one way you could use it, like in fight, right, as things evolve. You can also use this in your everyday teaching or learning, like going to your gym and having a match or a sparring session. If, say, your coach had you focusing on offense, let's say your coach had you doing drills where you got someone up against the edge of the ropes, and you're trying to finish him off, right? You're obviously not going to go full blast because you're sparring, unless you're a dick, but you're getting in the motions. One thing that's very common when you got someone against the ropes, especially when you're trying to finish them off, is you get into this very predictable push-pull rhythm, right? It's like 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. It's very rare that you double up or pause and do these rhythm disruptions. The reason for that is more you start going on instinct. You're trying to finish your opponent. And the problem with this is that you gas out. If you don't finish him, you're screwed. So then you start kind of doubling down in your mind because you're getting tired and you're like, oh, fuck, if I don't finish him, I'm screwed. So you start going harder. But you get predictable. It's just left, right, left, right, left, right. Now your opponent in defense, he starts matching it like this, right? You see this very often. It's like push, pull, push, pull, push, pull, push, pull, right? But if I know that when I was in my offense, I didn't do any of this defense in this drill. My coach only had me doing the offense, right? And I noticed that this problem occurred. Well, now I can understand how to advance my strategy in two ways, right? Both as an offensive fighter, adding in those rhythm disruptions, like I said, like instead of just going like this, double up on the jab or fake, or maybe add in some movements, step, come back, right? Keep them pinned, but don't just do this straight on. So now I've learned this through my understanding of how my opponent survived or adapted to me. And now never having been in this defensive position as my opponent, I also understand that, say, if I was my opponent and I had my guard like this, and so I have a lot of openings on the sides of my head, the offensive person is going to throw a lot of hooks to the head. And maybe that's what I was doing in my offense. I was throwing a lot of hooks to the head because that's where he was open, these sides of the temple. Well, now I know just from being in the offense that a good defense for that would be to bob under and then pivot out and then throw some jabs at range to get distance away, and I could turn it around on him. Now I could get him against the ropes, right? All this understanding comes from getting into my opponent's tendencies and thinking symmetrically. Instead of thinking about yourself in, I'm trying to adapt terminology from poker into and game theory into boxing in a way that would be understandable. You're going to look at the situation objectively, holistically. Like a situation like me and my opponent, I'm not thinking of myself subjectively. I'm not me. I take myself out and look at it as if it's two separate fighters, and then look at what fighter A, who's say on defense, and fighter B, say on offense, would optimally do if fighter A does this, fighter B does that, like how they would evolve in an optimal way to defend and to offensively gain ground and all this. So I take myself out, especially after I've done all these offensive drills in my daily coaching session, and I come home. Now when I'm visualizing, which every boxer should do, I'm thinking about what the other guy should have done, and I'm thinking about both guys, me and the other guy, in this objective way to criticize both of us and to think about how the adaptations would occur. Like, if he does this, I do that. And if this guy does that, I do this, right? Because now you can be in both bodies and both minds at once instead of having to actually be there. So then maybe the next time you go to the lesson and your coach has you against the ropes, you already know what to do. So now you can refine your techniques a lot better because you're not starting from absolute zero. You're starting from a knowledge base of what you learned from your symmetrical understanding of how you offensively handled and mishandled your opponent in this position to putting yourself in that frame of mind. And so now that coaching session the next day where you're in the defensive position is going to be 10 times more valuable, right? So this is how you could learn like 5 years of teaching in 1 year. And this is just by knowing how to think versus what to think. And a lot of coaches, whether they're doing this conscientiously or not, they'll string you along and they'll teach you more what to do rather than how to think, because they don't want you to go off on your own and be self-sufficient, because then they don't make money off you. Or they've just been taught poorly how to teach others. Because my goal as a coach, I want you to say, hey, Zach, fuck off. I don't need you, right? I want you to get to that point of self-sufficiency where you don't need me, because I've taught you a knowledge base that you can then start going on your own. Of course, you're going to want coaches in your life always to be an objective force, because no matter how much you pull yourself away and look at both fighters, you're still going to have some subjective biases, and you don't know everything. But the idea is still the same, that you want the person to be able to be independent and learn on their own, not only be able to learn when you, the coach, is available. Because then you have 24 hours a day to learn versus 1 hour a day. I mean, that's a superpower. That's better than PEDs in some ways, right? And that's why boxing is so fundamentally based upon your mentality, right? You need to know how to think to come up with these strategies. Game theory is super important, whether you know you're doing it or not. Everyone is employing game theory. That's just strategy. But understanding this, and I could give you 1,000 examples of how this actually applies, but I don't need to, because if you understand this concept, you start applying it to yourself in your own training and where you're weak and where you're strong, and in your training from day to day, and you will learn 10 times faster, and you'll come to me and you'll say, hey, thank you, random fat YouTube guy. You saved me thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours of time, and now I'm a superstar. And then when you're selling out arenas for $100 million a fight, maybe you chuck me a crumb or two, right? That's all, folks. Thanks very much.